So here I'm presenting Azar Majedi, who is the chairperson of the Organization for Women's Liberation from Iran. So in this interview topic, this discussion, she will talk about what is going on in Iran, what is the main theme of the current revolution in Iran, what the people wanted in Iran, and some other interesting topics. So let me first check with the first question. So, Esther, could you tell me what is the main thrust of the religious fundamentalism in Iran? So we know it is under the religious regime, and we know that before the religious regime, it was under the Shah regime as well. So, can you describe what is the difference between these two regimes, or which one, like sort of the oppressions under these regimes? Can you describe any of those similarities and differences, maybe?
Well, yes, Iran has been under dictatorship all throughout history. And let's look at back to the hundreds something years. And we've had two revolutions, quite a few uprising and protest popular movements, and now we're going through another one. And so there was another monarchy before the revolution of the sort of beginning of the 20th century, and then Britain organized a coup d'etat. I'm just going to jump over, there is not time, so I'm just going to give you the main points. Britain organized a coup d'etat and brought Reza Pahlavi, who was the father of the Shah, who was overthrown by the previous revolution. He came to power. He was a soldier, just an ordinary soldier. He took power through a coup d'etat organized by Britain. And then it was, of course, a dictatorship, a lot of people killed, imprisoned and stuff. But what he tried to do was she tried to push back the religious establishment, not get rid of them completely, just push it back, because it was a process of bringing capitalism to Iran. And capitalism, as it happened throughout history, they had to sort of at first get rid of the extra weight of the religion. It was not like, for example, France or anything like that, but anyway, pushed it back a bit, tried to cut down the roles and of the mullahs or clergy, if you like, and talked about women should be without the veil, so in sort of enforcing no veil on the society, and something that now the monarchies are trying to say, oh, see, this is what our father did, which, I mean, anyway. And then he, in the Second World War, he sided with Hitler. He was about to sign some, more kind of alliances with Hitler. Then I think it was the Allies, Britain, and they got rid of him. They banished him to Johannesburg, if I'm not mistaken, in South Africa, and brought his son to power. And then in 1953, there was this sort of nationalist prime minister who wanted to nationalize the oil, which anyway at that time was the main problems. The imperialist power, they wanted the oil, and he wanted to nationalize it. So this time CIA, with the help of Britain, organized another coup d'etat, took the prime minister away, and brought the Shah's son, which is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to power. So that was 1953. From 1953 to 1979, which we had another revolution, he, really established his power with iron fist in the society. His secret police was really, notorious, and a lot of torture, a lot of, executions, a lot of political prisoners, especially leftists and Marxists. And he, got a lot of wealth himself. When he left Iran, they say he took with him $2 billion. You're talking 1979.
Yeah. It's a
40
huge
something years
amount.
ago. 2 billion is, I don't know how much would be at this now. It was huge.
Yeah.
And then he had already a lot of assets outside, palaces and houses and property and all of that. And he took the sort of royal jewelry. That's, people's jewelry. He took them all with him. So now his family owns all of that. His family still are among the maybe 10 richest families in the world. And so around 1978, a sort of protest started, a protest movement started against the Shah, against the Sabak, which was his secret police abbreviated name. And people came to the street, and gradually they started shouting, "Death to the Shah, death to the Shah, death to the Shah." Then the main slogan you would hear was "Death to the Shah," and nothing really, nothing else. So the protest really grew. I remember in the end of summer 1978, in one day in Tehran, the army just started shooting at people's demonstration, just right there. And there was a talk of more than 3,000 killed. You never know exactly the correct number, but that was huge, and that was real. And then he had the stage of emergency, and then all of that. So finally, what happened? The West realized that the Shah's days are numbered, and there is a strong left inside the country. There is a lot of what I call leftist aspiration, not leftist organization, not leftist parties. In a dictatorship, it's very difficult for you to create an organization when anything you do, you're tortured and killed. And also, it was the Cold War, and so there was Soviet Union next door, and then the U.S. decided to organize a regime change and brought the West with it. That time, Brzezinski had this thesis of green belt, green symbolizing Islam. So you would have the green, that means Islam in the Middle East against the Soviet Union. And before that, they had already done it in Afghanistan. They had brought the Mujahideen, because then there was a regime in Afghanistan which was pro-Soviet. And Soviet Union got into the war, and then he had to pull back, and Mujahideen were in Afghanistan. So they've already done it in one country, decided to bring Islamists into Iran, and they succeeded. Khomeini then was in exile in Iraq. They asked Saddam Hussein to send him out, for with some bogus reasons, so he could be accessible to the media, and so this way he could be transferred to people's minds, if you like. So he sent him to Paris. A merchant, a rich Iranian merchant, had this mansion in close to Paris, Neuf-le-Château. They took him there every single day. BBC, Voice of Liberty, all those Western, and also the Israeli Farsi broadcasting. They interviewed him. They sent news. They read his leaflets and his press releases. It was amazing. Over less than a month, they made him a leader. A leader was born. Someone, not young people didn't even know him. He was someone at my father's generation. He had opposed the Shah, but he had not opposed the Shah from a progressive point of view. He had opposed the Shah, saying, "Why did you give votes to women? Why are you taking religious properties and assets away from them?" This was his main opposition. So anyway, to make the long story short, they brought him back. They brought the Islamists back and there were CIA members coming with him, Iranians, but working for CIA. People didn't know. And he became the leader, and people were gullible. I'm sorry to use that word, but media, Western media managed to make him a leader, and then many leftists then were anti-imperialist and populist, so they accepted it. There were only a small part of left, like I was working with one of them, very small organization. We of course were against it. We were going to the demonstrations. Then I remember in fall, just before the Shah left, and they were asking us to observe the veil already. And me and some of my comrades, we were discussing, arguing why. So then finally, US took the Shah out of Iran, and Islamic regime came to power. So this was the second and the most important and biggest Islamic regime in the Middle East. And then you had Iraq, Afghanistan, Taliban, Al Qaeda, Daesh. They're all US built. Everyone knows that now. Okay. So then from the day one, we Marxists had to fight with this regime. And there was an uprising in February. So mostly leftists. They took arms from the soldiers. They went to the jails. They freed their comrades who were in jail, who still remained in jail. And then what happened on 8th March 1979, we leftist women working in different women organizations were organizing a 8th March meeting, assembly, or whatever you want to call it. That was the first one. Maybe long time ago, there were a couple of 8th March. I don't know. It's not written. It's not documented. But under the Shah, 8th March was not allowed. So that was the first free 8th March we had. And we leftists, we were very young, of course. Yeah. We leftist Marxists tried to organize. I remember in Tehran, the capital, there were like 4 or 5 different meetings in different universities. We were working hard for these meetings, but so the leaflets were everywhere, posters were everywhere, and the regime knew that this is happening, so they had to kill it in the butt. So what they did at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, the radios broadcast Khomeini's sort of ruling that in all public institutions, public workers, women had to observe the veil. So the veil became obligatory, compulsory for public female workers. And that day, women just ran to the streets. It was incredible. That was a very important historical moment. The first ever protest against the regime, a mass protest. There were thousands of women in Tehran. And it was snowing. It was really incredible day. I never forget that day. So we were all on the streets of Tehran opposing this ruling, saying that we want freedom, we want equality for women. And I remember that Khomeini would keep talking against the West, against the East. So East meaning Soviet Union, West, okay? So saying no to East, no to West. And there was this beautiful slogan saying women's freedom is neither Eastern nor Western, but universal, if you like. So it was incredible what happened that day. And then we had 1 week of protest movement, sittings, meetings, protests. Finally, the regime had to back off. At that time, it was not strong enough. It backed off. It came back again in a year. It backed off. Finally, by 20th of June, I think it would be, 1981, it was a kind of a coup d'etat-like, if you like. It was the whole regime itself, but the action was like a coup d'etat, like, for example, what happened in Chile. They just rounded up everybody who was protesting on the streets, and kids 10 years old. leftists and anyone who protested against them. There was an Islamic organization called Mujahideen. They were first very much allied with the Khomeini, but then there were some issues. They sort of separated. And so they were protesting as well. They just rounded up everybody and took them to prison. And it was a bloody coup d'etat. In a decade that followed, from like 1981 to 1989, perhaps, or 1988, you never know how many, but they're talking about 100,000 executions or death under torture. Horrible tortures. And kids, as I said, 10, 12, 13, 14, just were executed or died under torture. And so that decade is a very dark and bloody decade. That's when, for example, me and my partner, Mansour Hekmat, we went to Kurdistan first to escape the sort of being taken, being imprisoned, and then we came to Europe, and this whole movement. So, but from like then in maybe few years later, the young generation started asking for more freedom, and of course women's rights were always among the top issues, against the veil and against gender apartheid. These two issues were very important. And so when you look at it, you have two dictatorships, the Shah and Islamic regime. It's capitalism in what you might call the countries which are, they call it underdeveloped, less developed, or dependent kind of. So you can not really have capitalism in those countries because they depend on cheap labor. You cannot have freedom or democracy in any sense. So dictatorship becomes the main thing. If you look at the whole world, except the Western world, you have dictatorship everywhere, and you've had it. And this is how it works. And it was same in Iran. And once people revolted against the monarchy and wanted to get rid of that dictatorship, there was a regime change by the West, by US, brought another dictatorship into the country and killed many, hundreds of thousands, if you just think about how many people they killed. And this time before was both nationalism and religion as two main ideology of capitalism. This time was basically Islam, religion, and then gradually they needed to bring nationalism in because people are becoming disillusioned, or disillusioned maybe is not the right word, but they very soon they saw who's ruling the country, and protests were starting. And we've had every few years we've had protests, large protests. They've been crushed. In 2009 we had a big one. It was crushed. Before that, few years before that, we had one. It was crushed. And then since almost 5 years ago, like since December 2017, the country has not been the same. We've had waves of protests, crushed, few months back, starting again. We've had workers' strikes, we have workers' protests, we've had a lot of activists and workers taken to jail, imprisoned, freed, taken to jail, tortured. So in the past almost 5 years, there have been constant protests. 2 years ago, the same month now, in November, there was a big 1 week or 10 days protest, really militant, and then was crushed again. But this time is different. It's already 50 days and it's going strong and is very progressive, and the young generation is not giving up, and it seems like this time is the last time.
That is a really great insight. I feel like I'm attending a short course on the Iran revolutions. That is a really insightful thing. That is really great.